We're going to talk about World War II today, and we can't really talk about World War II without talking about World War One, because a lot of the um, events that were set in motion by the Treaty of Versailles and World War One are going to be contributing factors to World War II. So some people argue that the time between World War One and World War II was just a pause in the same war. Um, I disagree with that because, I mean, yeah, there is an aspect of that is correct, but there's also the fact that World War II really wasn't one war. It was really three wars. It was a war between the Western Allies and Japan, and a war between the Western Allies and Germany, and a war between the Soviet Union and Germany. So really three different wars happening at the same time. All right, questions, comments? So let's go now and think about, well, what are the events that lead up to this? And the first thing we have to say is that, if you will recall, American foreign policy always was isolationist, that the United States didn't get involved in world affairs. The only time that Americans would get involved in world affairs would be if its trading relationships were threatened. And it's pretty much what we saw with World War One. But at the end of the war, even though the Americans won, most people in all of the countries that had fought World War One believed it was a huge mistake, and the world kind of fell into an emotional depression after the war. It was an era when people just thought that the whole thing had been a massive waste, and Americans definitely felt that way. So Americans didn't want to continue their involvement in world affairs. They wanted to go back into isolationism, and they did, actually. And one of the things that will happen politically, we see, that Roosevelt beat Hoover, and for a period of time between 1932 and 1938, the Congress was controlled by Democrats. So we had the Congress and the presidency controlled by Democrats. But then after I think it was actually 1936, the Republicans took control of the Congress, and they were very much against the idea of getting involved in another war. And so they passed laws that committed the United States to neutrality, that the United States was not going to get involved in any wars. And most people were actually on board with this. Most people thought that was a fine idea. Roosevelt, the president, actually wasn't on board with it because he saw basically two different problems happening. One was that American interests were being threatened in the Pacific, and the other was that democracy itself was being threatened in Europe. And Roosevelt was very much a Wilsonian diplomat, meaning that he believed in missionary diplomacy, that the United States had a mission to extend and protect democracy. And so when we look then at what was going on in the Pacific, as I'll kind of describe to you here in a minute, we can see that America had economic interests that were being threatened in the Pacific, and also America had ideological interests that were being threatened in Europe. And Roosevelt believed that the United States would eventually have to get involved in a war. All right. Well, we'll just leave it there, except to say that he started to make arrangements for that, even while the Congress was passing laws for American neutrality. And you can actually read in the book about how the United States kind of comes out of that isolationist shell even before Pearl Harbor. But one thing that we need to understand, it's a link between the Japanese and the Germans, and that there was a a treaty, an agreement between Germany, Japan, and Italy called the Tripartite Pact. And the treaty was really aimed at the Soviet Union, because both Germany and Japan saw the Soviet Union as a threat, and Italy was on board because they were allied with Germany, right? But the consequence of that was that everybody knew that if the United States went to war with Japan, or if Japan went to war with the United States, then Germany would also declare war on the United States. Okay, so there was this is something that is out in the open. Everybody knows this is going to happen. All right. Questions, comments? Okay. All right. So now in the Pacific, one of the things that had happened in the Pacific was that Japan was a rising industrial nation. Japan had forced industrialization in the end part of the 19th century, but Japan was an industrial power like the British industrial powers, meaning that it had a powerful industrial plant, but they didn't have access to resources, and they had to get those resources elsewhere. Japan acted like the European imperialists and sought control over different places in Asia where they could gain their resources. But with that power, the rising industrial power, they were also becoming a rising military power. And really, their only rival in the Pacific was the United States. The United States was, by this time, the world's greatest industrial power. And the United States had interest in Asia, particularly in the Philippine Islands, because the United States owned the Philippine Islands. So the difference between Japan and the United States, industrially or economically, was that Japan did not have control of its resources, and the United States did, because the United States had all of its resources on the North American continent. And so that made Japan dependent on imperialism. And one of the things that they did then, as a result of the Great Depression, the military took control of the government and said, well, we're gonna supply our industry with resources by invading other countries. And so they invade Manchuria, they invade China, and then they set out on a course. Their stated plan was to conquer essentially all of Asia, right? To use it as their kind of empire for control, for contributing to their industrial plant. All right. So the Japanese are threatening in Asia, and Roosevelt, as president, realizes this is a threat to American interests in the Philippines. And so the tensions are going to, in the 1930s, will be rising between the United States and Japan. And eventually what will happen is that the United States will declare an embargo against Japan. And what that means is that Japan can't buy goods from the United States. But the problem is that the Japanese economy depends on goods from the United States, wood and steel in particular. And so if the United States stops selling those resources to Japan, that means they have to get them somewhere else. And so what will happen then is that Japan will come up with a plan. They'll make a decision that they're going to accomplish one massive offensive throughout the Pacific and take over essentially all of the Pacific, and then they're going to declare that to the world as a fait accompli, right? Keeping in mind now that at this point, the Western powers have demonstrated that they're not really willing to enforce the punitive aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. You guys follow me here? Questions? And so the Japanese think, well, the Americans are in depression, and the other countries aren't really willing to to back up their threats that were made with the Treaty of Versailles. So we'll just do this, and we'll present it to the world as a fait accompli, and that means a done deal. And that after that, that we'll get away with it, essentially. Nobody will respond. You guys follow me here? But they were afraid that just they didn't know, and they were afraid that the United States might respond. And they knew that the United States fleet was at Pearl Harbor. And so they decided, as part of their offensive, that they would bomb Pearl Harbor, with the idea that if they bombed Pearl Harbor and crippled the American Pacific Fleet, that would discourage the Americans from getting involved. Okay, so as part of their expansion in Asia, they took over basically everything that's inside the green here, right? And at the same time, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and they did actually cripple the American fleet, but that didn't discourage the Americans. It enraged the Americans, right? And so what the attack on Pearl Harbor did was it changed American public opinion from isolationism and neutrality to being totally in favor of war against the Japanese. And at the same time, it brought Germany into the war against the United States. You guys follow what I'm saying here? So
are you supposed to be sharing your screen?
I was gonna
Am I
ask.
not sharing the screen?
No.
I'm sorry. I always do that. Why do I always do that?
Yeah, I heard it in the green, and I was like, "Are we supposed to be looking at something right now?"
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, hopefully you were learning a lot from just my talking, but actually this is what we were looking at, the map here. So the Japanese have expanded throughout this area that's inside the green here. You guys get what I'm saying? And that includes the Philippines. So the Japanese took over the Philippines, but the strategy, the gamble that they took was that if they bombed Pearl Harbor and crippled the American fleet, that would keep the United States out of war. But in reality, it had exactly the opposite effect, because Americans were enraged, and so Americans changed their attitude from one of neutrality to one in favor of a war against Japan. And at the same time, because of the Tripartite Pact, Germany declares war on the United States. Okay, you guys are with me? So now the United States is involved in two wars, one in Europe and one in the Pacific. All right, questions, comments?
With Pearl Harbor, like, how big was the like, how many ships were there? How much damage to the actual Navy did they intend to do? Was it like more morale, or was it more trying to do damage to the Navy?
No, actually, most of the American fleet was there, and most of the American fleet was destroyed. And so the United States really did take a big hit at Pearl Harbor in terms of its military capability in the Pacific. The counterbalance to that was that the United States had a very efficient industrial plant that could be quickly fit to produce war material. So the United States could, even though there were a number of ships that were destroyed, Americans could actually produce ships faster than the Japanese could destroy them, right? There was a period of time when the United States was actually launching a destroyer every day, right? Do you follow what I'm saying here? And so because of that, even though the fleet was crippled, the United States could overcome that. And one of the advantages that the United States had over Japan was that their industrial plant wasn't big enough to do that. So when the United States destroyed Japanese ships, they couldn't replace them. It took too long for them to replace them. So the American fleet kept growing. Actually, the American war machine kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the war, as the Japanese ability to make war kept decreasing.